we're going to be talking about dogs who guard resources. I will be speaking for most of the time, but the amazing Kelly Duer, our foster care specialist at Maddie's Fund, will be talking as well. I'm going to start with telling a story about one particular dog. It was a dog that looked someone like this. You'll see a picture of her, an actual picture of her soon. But she was a mixed breed dog, and I was working at a shelter in California at the time. This was about 17 years ago now. And she was a puppy. She was about 4 months of age, and at the time it was standard for us to do behavior assessments on every single dog that came into the shelter. She was probably 6 months old when I first met her. And this little dog bit the assess a hand during her behavior assessment, and it was the shelter's policy at the time to euthanize dogs who displayed that behavior. And I questioned whether it was the right decision to euthanize a puppy who is just starting their life, and there's so much we can potentially do to help them. Obviously, there are some not obviously, but there are some very, very challenged puppies out there that genetically have problems. But most puppies that I meet, there's so much we can do to help them if we're doing the right thing. So that's what I did with what became Little Lucy. That became her name. I fostered her, and within 2 days in my home, she was not guarding resources at all. And I ended up adopting Lucy out to a friend of mine. This is kind of a blurry picture of her, but you can see her in her old age. She lived a long, happy life and never guarded a resource ever after those 2 days out of the shelter. So she really made me start to think about these resource guarding dogs, and I've fostered lots of resource guarding dogs since that time, and did research about resource guarding when I was at the Center for Shelter Dogs. My last name was Darpino then, and since that time, there's a lot more research on this topic that I'm excited to talk to you about today. There's a lot I want to talk about today. We're probably going to have to skip over parts of it, but we'll get through as much as we possibly can. That is my dog, Mister, who was a resource guarding dog that I adopted, who also the only resource he ever guarded was a dead squirrel that he found out on our property. And he lived until he was 12, but he also bit the fake hand on the resource guarding test. I want to start with a definition. This is a definition from Jacqueline Jacobs, whose PhD was focused on resource guarding in dogs. I was really excited when I found and read all of her work. And one of the first projects that she did in her PhD was developing an agreed upon definition of resource guarding. So you can see this definition: the use of avoidance, threatening, or aggressive behaviors by a dog to retain control of food or non-food items in the presence of a person or other animal. And I think it's very valuable that she talks about not just aggressive behaviors as part of resource guarding, but avoidance and threatening behaviors, which we'll talk about here. So the three different categories that Dr. Jacobs talks about, you can see on the screen. So avoidance is pretty obvious, right? These are the dogs that when they have a resource, they grab it and run away with the item. They do things to avoid you acquiring that resource. Aggressive behavior, the second category she has, I think we all understand that. And then rapid ingestion as resource guarding, that's something that you can see, and it's actually a video on the bottom. That's something that is often noticed and observed in our behavior assessment tests, is dogs eating faster, and she called that out as a specific category within resource guarding. So these three categories of behavior. We're obviously most interested in the aggression piece, because public safety is important to us and those of us who work in the shelter. So this is a video that shows the fast eating. You can see on the screen it showed this was a 10-week-old golden retriever puppy. They already knew that she had a problem with aggression. They start petting her with the rubber hand, and she starts growling every time they pet her. And I'm not going to keep showing this video, but it escalates over time. So that was an example of fast eating, which then turned into aggression with repeated provocation. I always like to mention that resource guarding is usually normal dog behavior, not always normal dog behavior. This is kind of an old-timey picture that depicts a dog guarding his child from danger. Apparently that other dog on the bottom was killed protecting the girl. Apologies if that's upsetting to see. Guarding versus protection. So when we talk about resource guarding, there are lots of different reasons, right, that animals can be guarding resources. The picture in the upper right corner is of a little dog that was protecting her owner while her owner was protecting with aggression towards strangers when her owner was recovering from an injury. The dog in the upper left is kind of that classic dog, I'm sure we've all seen them, that doesn't want to get off the bed and shows aggressive behavior to maintain possession of that bed environment. Sometimes dogs, the middle pictures are fearful little puppy. It's important to remember that fearful dogs may appear that they are guarding resources, but the reality is that they're actually fearful of the person and the fake hand, but they don't really care about the resource. And then obviously the picture on the bottom left, we have breeds that are bred to guard, sheep in this case, but that doesn't mean they won't potentially guard other things as well. And then the bottom picture there is put there to remind us all that we can teach dogs to guard resources, either intentionally or unintentionally. And I think that's a really important thing to think about when we are assessing and potentially working with these dogs, is thinking about, are we potentially teaching them things that we don't want them to do? In this video here, the person pets, and you saw the beginning of it, but they keep petting with that fake hand until the dog, the little 10-week-old puppy, eventually bites and shakes the fake hand. And yes, this dog did already have a history of biting in a previous home, but demonstrating by provoking until their behavior escalates is teaching them that they need to escalate in order to protect themselves, because the person didn't stop until the dog actually bit the fake hand. All right, sorry, just having a little trouble getting to the next slide. Oh, I'm not going to show that right now. So let's talk about some of the research that's out there with regard to resource guarding and assessing resource guarding in shelters. So we have several different studies that have demonstrated that about 14% of our shelter dogs will show guarding behaviors on food or valuable chew item like a rawhide or a pig's ear test. Dr. Mohan Gibbons' research in 2012 looked at 11 different shelters, and it was on average 14% of shelters, whereas Dr. McGuire's research looked at, which is recent research, 2020, looked at one shelter that had 14% of shelter dogs showing guarding behaviors. So that's shelter dogs. But what about the prevalence of resource guarding with dogs in homes? Does anybody know, what would you estimate if you were going to guess, or if you actually know the answers to this, that's great too. What is the prevalence of resource guarding in a home environment? Type in chat. We got one person saying around 6%. Any other guesses? No one else is brave enough to. We have 10%. It looks like I'm saying 25%. That's not the real me, but I could have guessed that. Minor low-level guarding, I'd say 50% at least, 5%, 0%. Thank you for all the guesses. So, first, the answer is from a 2001 study by Dr. Norma Guy. In that study, 5% of dogs in home demonstrated resource guarding behavior related to toys, food, or other objects. The finding data regarding the prevalence in homes can be quite challenging, because a lot of the studies that look at how often it happens are looking at referral hospitals, so behavior specialists that aren't representative of the general population. But it was 5%, which is very different than the 14% we're seeing in shelters. And why is that happening? Is it because dogs are stressed in shelters and that's why they're guarding resource, or is it because more dogs who guard resources are being relinquished to shelters, or is it some other reason? Another study found that, this is Dr. Reisner in 2007, that possessive aggression was the most common cause of bites to familiar children. So and this is my dog, Mister, who I told you, he was a resource guarder. He died at the age of 12, just a couple months ago. That's him with my son, CJ, when he was little. And so it's a public safety concern. So yes, it's 5%, but it is something that we certainly need to think about and be concerned about. Jacobs, in her PhD, this is a 2017 study, looked at factors that influenced whether resource guarding would happen in homes. So this was not a shelter study. And this is a really, really interesting study. I feel like we could spend the whole hour talking about this one study, because she looked at risk of resource guarding related to the 3 types that we talked about earlier, but specifically with regard to biting. So there was an increased risk of biting as compared to a dog who threatened without biting, with dogs who had regular interactions with teenagers. So dogs who regularly interacted with teenagers were 2.21 times as likely to bite as the dogs who threatened. So the OR stands for odds ratio, which means they're as likely as. Hand feeding dogs between 4 months and 1 year also doubled the risk of a dog biting versus threatening. Showing resource guarding between dogs increased the odds 6 times that a dog would bite over resources. And alternatively, dogs that were trained to leave it were less likely to bite. So training dogs to leave items and leave it resulted in them less likely to bite versus threatened. So like I said, that was a really, really interesting study, and I'd love to discuss more of it, or I'd love to get Dr. Jacobs to speak for us sometime, because there are a lot of factors we should be thinking about. But I want to talk more about our behavior assessments here and point out that several studies have talked about the concerns about the accuracy of our tests for resource guarding. We know that there have been pro and con articles published about behavior assessments in general, but this is specifically about resource guarding. And Martyr et al. Study, this was a study that I was involved with in 2013, we found that 45, so we looked at both of these studies, looked at dogs who were assessed in the shelter. We may or may not have had intake information about them, and then went to a home environment. In both of these studies, dogs could have bitten the fake hand, so they weren't excluded based on their behavior in the behavior assessment. Although in the Martyr study, dogs were excluded if on intake they had a history in the home of biting over food or delicious chew toys, serious biting, or they had multiple different types of behavior problems, but they weren't euthanized based on results of a behavior assessment test. So 45% of the dogs that showed resource guarding on the behavior assessment test did not guard resources in the home, so they were false positive. And then McGuire looked at this again 7 years later in 2020, and she found an even higher rate of false positives. So aggression over toys, bones, when toys, bones, or valuable objects were removed, 52.6% of those that were positive in the shelter on the assessment test did not guard in the home. And related to food, 66.7%. So we have a high rate of false positives, which is actually very common when we have a behavior like resource guarding that has a low prevalence, 5%. False positives are very common. We also have false negatives. False negatives are usually much lower in the rate in situations with a problem that has a low prevalence, so the problem that's less common. So the rate of false negatives, you can see in the Martyr study, there were 22% were false negatives, were the two conditions in the McGuire study, and there were actually many more conditions discussed. But toys, bones, valuable objects, 11.1% false negatives, food, 2.6%. So this was false positives means they were judged to be guarding resources, but they didn't actually do it in the home. False negative means they said they weren't guarding resources, but they actually did in the home. And false positives and negatives have different consequences, right? A false positive oftentimes results in a dog being killed when they don't really have a problem. False negative results in a dog having food aggression in a home when we weren't aware of it. And so that certainly can be a challenge for the owner. So I am going to share a couple of slides. Thanks to all of you who filled out our resource guarding survey. I'm going to share a couple slides from that survey. And this particular question was looking at how shelters in the U.S. would make outcome decisions for dogs relinquished with different conditions. So in this situation, a dog is relinquished to the shelter without a history of food aggression. The shelter does a behavior assessment and reveals that the dog displayed the aggressive behavior described. So green on this is tense body posture during the food aggression assessment. Blue is growling. Yellow is snap at the rubber hand. Light blue is bit the rubber hand, and orange is bit and shook the rubber hand. So this is a dog, no history of food aggression before intake, and behavior assessment in the shelter reveals the following. And you can see that where decision making in general goes, that a dog that bit the rubber hand in the shelter, no evidence in the home, 45% of us would euthanize that dog. And I think that's something that we really need to think about, because we know that there's about a 50% rate of false positives. And if we only have that one bit of information that we know has a 50-50 chance of being inaccurate, is that the right decision for our shelter, our community? I think that's something that we all need to discuss, and we'll discuss that more today. So what if we stopped assessing for food aggression? I think this is many of our challenges, that we understand that the test isn't accurate, but what else can we do? I'm concerned about public safety. We're all concerned about public safety. Dr. Mohan Gibbons did a study that was published in 2018 where they recruited 9 different shelters that stopped assessing for food aggression over 2 months. Is there anybody here whose organization was part of the study? Please type in the chat if you were one of those organizations. What happened in this study is that there were over 14,000 dogs included in this study over a 4-month period, so a very large sample size. And for the first 2 months of the study, they did their standard assessment protocol, so a standardized behavior assessment test that included assessing for resource guarding, followed by 2 months of not doing the food guarding test. So they still did the behavior assessment test, just eliminated the food guarding portion. And overall, in this study, they found that 5% of dogs were food aggressive and guarded their food on either the behavior assessment, which was only done in the first 2 months, observed in shelter, so shelter observations, or via behavior history. So 8% of dogs during baseline were identified as food aggressive, and 3% during the investigative period, which is when they stopped doing the food guarding tests. That 5% difference is because they weren't identifying dogs via a test. And the results that they found, they looked at several different factors. They looked at safety. They found that food guarding dogs were no more likely to inflict injury in the shelter or in the home, comparing baseline versus the investigative phase. It's important that this inflict injury, for the purposes of this study, any injury that happened might not have been related to resource guarding was counted as an injury. So the dog may have pulled someone over because they were very strong and the person ruptured their cruciate ligament. That was counted as an injury if it was reported. The dog may have bit a stranger when the stranger came into the house. That was counted in as an injury. So they counted all injuries. They found that overall, adopters were more likely to report bites and injuries from the food guarding dogs, 8 reports there, than from the non-food guarding dogs. So overall, there were more bites in the food guarding dogs, but the prevalence of biting the incidence of biting in these dogs was very, very low overall. That's out of 14,000 dogs, right? Outcomes. They also looked at outcomes, and 54% of these resource guarding dogs were adopted during the baseline period, 58% during the investigation, so more likely to be adopted when they didn't have that test. 39%, that first number was an overall number. 39%, so overall number of dogs adopted, not resource guarding. 39% of the resource guarders, and 45% for 39 in baseline and 45 in investigative were adopted. So higher adoption rate overall during the investigation period, and also a higher adoption rate of the resource guarding dogs. They also found that more of the food guarding or resource guarding, sorry, I keep using different abbreviations here, I didn't notice that, were euthanized than food guarding dogs. So 15.4% of dogs who guarded resources were euthanized as opposed to almost 11% of non-food guarding. Length of stay. The length of stay was higher for resource guarding days, so an average of 13.6 days than for non-resource guarding dogs. So length of stay definitely increased if they were identified as a resource guarder. Returns. The resource guarding dogs were not more likely to be returned. Returns in the investigation phase were 11% when they dropped the food aggression tests. Baseline returns were 9%, so no significant difference there. Overall, there were more dogs returned during the investigation phase than the baseline phase, but once again, it was not due to the resource guarding dogs. However, so this is all from the Mohan-Gibbons study, but a McGuire 2020 study found that dogs with more severe resource guarding were more likely to be returned than less severe, mild to moderate resource guarding. So 40% of more severe were returned, only 17% of mild to moderate. However, she noted that 96% of the dogs in this study were eventually placed. Only one of the dogs was euthanized. So jumping back and forth between some of the data from the survey that we just sent out, this is one of the pieces. Right now, looking at how many of our survey respondents performed standardized behavior assessment tests on 25% or more of our dogs. And that is about 50-50. So about 50% of respondents perform behavior assessments pretty regularly, 50% do not. This is a huge change than the last data I saw reported from Dr. Mohan-Gibbons that reported that 89% of us were doing standardized behavior assessments. So we're certainly changing based on the information that we've gathered over time, but we still have questions. What's the right thing to do? How do we protect public safety? How do we do what's best for our communities? I am going to skip over this slide just in the interest of time. I'm going to skip over a couple of slides here. Actually, I'm going to show this one really quick. So this is looking at, do our organizations adopt out dogs displaying different behaviors? I think this is really valuable for us all to look at, to see what everybody else is doing. And you can see the highlighted areas. There are some people who will never adopt out a dog who growls, but the highlighted are where the highest percentage of answers were. So most people will adopt out a dog who growls. It's kind of a mixed bag. The highest number was sometimes. Organizations will adopt out a dog who snaps, more in the always and frequently than in the rarely never. When we get to actually biting, that's when things change, and certainly makes sense because biting is more of a risk to our communities. But we can see that we're getting into the rarely's and never more frequently when we have level 3 bites. So this is a bite that breaks the skin. A level 4 bite is a deep bite, and this is where 71% of us, it's a deep bite, it's a serious bite, 71% of us would not adopt out a dog with that type of history. And then 97% of us would not adopt out a dog with a level 5 bite, which is a very, very, very serious bite. So you can see there's a progression, which makes a lot of sense in terms of what we will and won't adopt out in terms of severity. But I want to clarify and say that there were lots of comments on the survey that it was really hard to answer, because when you don't have all the information, it's hard to make a general judgment about what you will do, and I really appreciate all the thoughts about that. So, evaluating potential resource guarders, what do? We have all this information about false positives and false negatives, and is it right to be killing dogs based on a test with a 50% accuracy? That's something that only your organization can make a decision about, but my recommendation based on the research that we have is that we should be continuing to collect historical information and shelter observations. What about assessing dogs who have a history of resource guarding in the home? Don't we need to assess those in the shelter? You can see that I would argue no. We have a history of resource guarding in a home environment. What more is assessing the dog in an environment going to do other than to teach the dog that people are going to provoke him? We already have that information. I don't think testing gives us more information. I'd love to hear in the chat if anybody feels differently about that and why. The recommendation from the ASPCA and from myself is as well is to not do a formal assessment for resource guarding. So removing, if you're still going to do standardized assessment, remove that resource guarding piece just because of the high rate of false positives. I do strongly recommend sending dogs to experienced foster homes for further evaluation when we have situations where we're uncertain about, is this dog safe to play? So there are some dogs that come in with historical information that makes it very, very serious bites that make it clear to us that with this serious bite, it's unsafe to place them. There's a lot of gray zones, and the majority of our dogs, it seems like, are these kind of gray zone dogs where we're saying, what do we do? And those dogs I really advocate for sending to an experienced foster home. If you are going to assess it further, I recommend not using a provocative test where you're poking the dog. I'm going to show a video here that gives an example of how I used to do a further assessment of resource guarding, and also making sure that we are all tracking data. If you're going to stop doing that formal assessment for resource guarding, tracking data before and after you do it and following up with our adopters. And here's going to be a little video of further evaluation of food aggression. This is a video from the Center for Shelter Dogs, where I used to work and where we did our resource guarding research. This is Lainey is the person and MJ is the dog. The first thing we would do in our assessment, I want to be clear here that this is not how I recommend doing an assessment specifically. This dog is not tethered, and that is extremely unsafe. So please do as I say, not as I do, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. But first we're just going to observe his body language. Is he showing warning signs to us? Does he have tense body posture? Is he staring at us? Is he tensing up or eating faster as we adjust our position and move around a little bit? Don't recommend walking so closely initially. This was a dog that we knew very, very well and just was doing this for the purposes of the video. But our next step, so first is just observing the dog doing nothing. Next is walking around in the environment. Acknowledging that even with this further assessment, I'm doing everything I can not to severely provoke the dog, but I'm still provoking him by walking by him when he has something that is his, and he's still in the shelter environment, which is a very stressful environment and might be impacting his behavior. So we do things like walking around him, and then our next step is we're going to start tossing high value treats while he's eating to see if he'll leave the food bowl while he
MJ.
when we tossed the treat. So Lainey just said his name, tossed him a treat, and
MJ.
and there's another one. So he'll regularly leave the food bowl for a valuable treat.
MJ.
All right. Supporting dogs so we're going to move on to the next portion of this, and I want to talk very briefly. I'd love to talk more about this, and if there is more interest in this topic, we can potentially include this in another session. However, for the purpose of today, I want to get to Kelly Duer and the part that she's going to talk about. These in general are the steps that I take and I recommend taking with dogs who don't like to share or guard resources. So making sure that we are keeping these dogs healthy in every way possible, physically and mentally. Avoiding situations where aggression might occur, so avoiding practicing that behavior. Building a relationship with the dog. One of my theories, which I don't have research to support, but has been my personal experience, is that the more a dog has a relationship with me where they see me as someone that they like and enjoy, the less likely they are to want to bite me, right? I don't know if we will ever have research that proves that it's true, but it's something that I think about often. Using the right tools in terms of treats and baby gates and crates and things like that to keep people safe. Behavior modification, so modifying behavior to reduce the likelihood. That was something that a lot of you talked about in the survey with regard to making decisions. Many people were not comfortable making outcome decisions without attempting behavior modification. And then doing things like considering medications, acupuncture, etc. All right, I am going to jump forward so we can get to the next section. And apologies while I get to that place. Oh, perfect. Okay. So now we're going to talk about things to do, things to consider, and things to talk about related to if we're not going to do this behavior assessment, what are we going to do? One of the big concerns is liability. Don't I have to do that resource guarding test because I'm going to be held liable if I don't do it? What about liability? You mentioned sending these dogs to foster. What about liability there? There's a great blog from American Pets Alive from Ryan Clinton talking about liability risks with regard to behavior in animal shelters. And really, it's all about being transparent about what we know, not making claims. So not saying this dog is good with kids, not because that's somewhat of a guarantee and we don't really know. So not making claims that we are not confident we can back up, and having good insurance. And not good insurance because we're expecting dogs to bite and we're just putting them out there. I don't want to come across as that at all. But we're doing everything we can to keep our community safe, going off of the information and the research that we have and learning from it. All right, and I am going to turn it over to Kelly, who's going to talk about sending dogs to foster and thinking about that concept with these resource guarding dogs. Thank you, Kelly.
Oh, happy to. Thank you. So we have 3 dogs here, and I just wanted to get to tell you a little about them and then have you put in the chat which dog you would choose to start with if you did not have a behavioral foster program, if you were just starting out. So you've got Kona, who was adopted out as a puppy to a family that had a bunch of kids. She's 11 months old now. She had a level 2 bite when the child reached for her food, and she's fearful of some men. You've got Gray, who's kind of a mess, very close to being euthanized and severely, severely shelter stressed. He guards food, toys, and fabric. He had a level 3 bite when a volunteer tried to stop him from destroying the seats in her car. No pre-shelter history at all, but he's a volunteer favorite, and you're getting a lot of pressure. And then Cody, who lived with kids in his last home, and the family said he did great. They didn't say he had any notable behavior history, but he growled at the fake hand during the assessment. So if you're looking at these 3 dogs, who is the one you would consider sending to foster if your program was really new?
But I'll type
Yep.
in chat. Great.
Awesome. I think this is what's really hard about this, is that there's the pressure, and Gray is really close to being euthanized, but that is a much higher level dog that needs somebody who really knows what they're doing. Go to the next one. Oh, okay. So bridge fosters, they can be really, really helpful. And I've seen organizations use local trainers, kind of like dog whisperers that they find through other people, staff, their own fosters, really different. So what they are is kind of a shorter term foster placement, so that the shelter can learn more about them and kind of, and then this bridge foster would be able to support their future behavior foster. And kind of, they also are able to kind of separate the role of shelter stress out from their actual, issues. If it's a dog who's like severely stressed and you just don't know how they're going to do in foster, a bridge foster may be something that you want to consider. So, and in a lot of cases, these are people that are getting paid. So at Friends of the Fairfax County Animal Shelter, we had a trainer. He was not necessarily a trainer, but he was a dog whisperer kind of person. And they paid him $500 for a dog to go there for a week. And he kind of gave a, good workup, got to know the dog, and then would pass them off to the next foster. And with a lot of information that would help them to work with them. The friends were able to support this. They sent quite a few dogs to him. They got like a $2,000 grant from a community foundation. And then we did a sponsorship program and raised the rest of the money online. So we would, post a dog, talk about why they needed it. And we were able to get pretty much everything funded in that way. Oh, the next one. So in cultivating behavior fosters, so one thing you might think about doing if you don't have any behavior fosters, and you're also you don't have a lot of adult dog fosters, what Kristen Hassan did in Fairfax was that she used short-term foster to kind of get people comfortable with taking big dogs home. And then, and in that way was able to kind of normalize it. So what they would do is, if a dog was there, say the dog had been there for a month and it was like a longer stay than usual, they would ask, hey, can somebody take, Nunu for 1 week and see how she is in a home? We want to get some marketing on her. We want to learn more about her. And people agreed to that, pretty readily, because it was a very short period of time. And it worked. We saw it work with many dogs, where they went to a home for a week. They, learned a lot about them. They got all the marketing material and they went back to the shelter, and then they were adopted. So that may be a way to kind of start if you don't know where to start. And then also your experienced volunteers, you're really the ones who can handle the high level dogs. I mean, they're already working with leash activity. They're already, doing a lot of the things that they would need to do at home. And the shelter is an incredibly stressful place for a dog. Let those volunteers know they can foster, and also network with them, because they may not be able to foster, but they might be able to take a dog to on a field trip, and they might be able to ask a friend, if that friend is able to foster. In Fairfax's case, one of the volunteers adopted one of the behavior foster dogs, and in looking for a trainer, she found one and ended up recruiting him as a volunteer. So he came back and basically like started a behavior program at our shelter as a volunteer. And so definitely use as much help as you can get. Oh, next one, sorry. And then with cultivating behavior fosters, first, make sure to prioritize fosters who have the home setups that you need the most. So if you need homes for, people who, homes that don't have other pets, when you see a foster sign up who doesn't have other pets, make sure you're giving them a lot of one-on-one. You give them the individualized matchmaking and support. And also, if you're doing public pleas for foster and you really need people who, don't have little kids or pets, say it in your plea. Say, we need fosters for these dogs. And by the way, we really need fosters for, who don't have other, kids and pets as well. And a lot of organizations call them unicorn fosters and kind of make it like a badge of honor. And that seems to work pretty well. And as I was doing this, I spoke with Laura Thomas, who is, I believe she runs the behavior program at Austin Pets Alive. But she had done a little survey of their behavior fosters as to why senior dog program manager. Thank you. She's amazing. And she did a survey as to why people, did behavior foster and all kinds of things.
Limit is 65.
And what she found was that a lot of them, it was an identity thing. And it's funny because I've heard people say that before, and it's true. Fostering isn't just something you do. It is an identity. It's something that, and so people seek to become members of groups that raise their self-esteem. Basically, you want to be the person, like the behavior fosters are generally people who want to be the person that takes up for the underdog, that, goes the extra step. And so, promoting the program as a way that they can do that can be helpful. Trying to remember why. Oh, Clyde. So Clyde was a dog in Fairfax who was severely shelter stressed. We knew nothing about him basically other than that he behaved terribly. And so his bio was horrifically off-putting. And I use it because it's just so ridiculous. I also really need some training because I'm like a bull in a china shop. So when they were asking for fosters to take this dog home, nobody's raising their hand. And we had a foster at the time, and we were kind of teaming with another family, and they were going to take her for the weekend. So she went to them. We had an opening, and I was like, we'll take Clyde for the weekend because if we don't, he's going to die. And he came to our house, and he was like a completely different dog. And then in doing the report, click one more time. There's another picture that comes up. So in doing the report and telling, in posting in the social media group, it was like, Sunday night at 6 p.m. and I'm like sweating because I'm like I can't bring this dog back to the shelter. But one of the other fosters saw him, and she said to me later, she said, I knew that he would be good in my house because you knew so much about him and because he had done so well in yours. So don't underestimate the power of short-term foster, especially for the dogs that are shelter stressed. I think that's it.
Thank you, Kelly. We are just about out of time, so we're unfortunately not going to have time for questions. If you would like to stay past the hour and have time, we're happy to answer questions there. Otherwise, please type your questions into the chat and we will answer them on Maddie's Pet Forum. Charlotte, can you share the link to the job-alike discussion in Maddie's Pet Forum? All right, and in this last minute, I just want to talk about home setups for dogs who guard resources. So the research that we have tells us that things like a low traffic home are going to be better for dogs. Avoid homes with children. And we now know teenagers. Avoiding homes with teenagers makes sense with me. I know with a lot of clients I've had challenges because teenagers kind of do what they want, right? And they're not the best at following rules many times unless you're really lucky parents. So avoiding those, but remembering there's an exception to every rule. I oftentimes avoid having other pets in the home. If I can, I don't usually ask these questions, but if I could, I would pick tidy people who don't often leave things on the ground that a resource guarding dog might want to grab. So our first home setups that we're sending these dogs to are the cream of the crop, these kind of perfect setups, so we can learn more about their behavior and figure out an outcome that's best for our communities. Lots of recommendations for what we tell these foster caregivers that I would cover when I am sending this type of dog to an adoptive or a foster home. You can see some of these are on the screen. So teaching people about what a valuable item might be. Many people don't think that socks and underwear are things that dogs absolutely love and might guard. Limiting access to these valuable items, only giving them when the dog is in a safe location. One of the big things that I talk about is if you drop something, do not pick it up. If we have a dog who we know has a questionable history, they didn't have a home history, but they resource guarded on the behavior assessment test, I'm going to be really cautious, and I would rather have my organization pay that $1,000 emergency fee for the dog eating the rat poison so he can get the medication to cure him than to reach in his mouth and grab it when someone is going to be injured. So I talk about that in detail, and you can see other items listed on the screen here. We're out of time to talk about it in detail, but things like trading for treats, practicing remembering not to pick something up if you drop it, if the dog is right there, and keeping treats all around the house in safe locations where the dog won't steal them. Very important, just not disturbing the dog when they're eating, letting them eat in peace, and not picking up that bowl when the dog is around. So removing the dog from the area and then picking up the bowl. That was a lot. Thank you all for joining.